That night, the sky split open with lightning, and the rain lashed down as if it wanted to wash all life off the earth. On the roadside, I saw a young woman clutching an infant to her chest. She stood beneath the pouring rain, trembling and hiding her face. I stopped and opened the door without thinking where it might lead. But when we reached my home, my own son stood on the doorstep and blocked the way. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Clarence Doyle. I was 74 years old that autumn, and I had lived in the same corner of western Pennsylvania for all my life. I'd been a high school math teacher for 39 years before retiring. Numbers had a comfort to them. Order, logic, patterns. They didn't change with the wind, didn't leave without warning, didn't raise their voices or look away in silence. Numbers had no storm in them. People did. And that evening, as the clouds churned above the highway, I felt more vulnerable than I ever had in my decades working under fluorescent lights and chalk dust. The forecast had been warning about the thunderstorm all morning, but I had errands to run. I didn't like driving at night anymore, especially with my eyesight softening at the edges and my hands slower to respond on wet roads. But I needed milk, and I needed bread, and I needed to get out of the house where the silence rang louder than the ticking clock. The silence had settled in since Margaret passed. She used to hum while she folded laundry, used to talk to herself in the kitchen, used to leave drawers slightly open, like she never really finished with anything. Now the drawers stayed shut. The air inside the house never moved unless I made it, so I welcomed excuses to leave, even if they led me into a storm. By the time I started back from town, the wind had already shifted, the kind of shift that ripples through the trees like a warning. I felt it before I saw it. The sky was the color of a bruise, swollen and uneasy, and the first crack of lightning opened up the horizon like a broken bone. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles stiff and pale, the way they'd always been since arthritis had come to stay in my hands. My old Ford Ranger shuddered against the wind as I pulled onto Route 219, a back road I knew like the wrinkles on my palm. I always preferred it to the faster route. Less traffic, fewer lights, more trees. Margaret used to say the trees whispered when you drove past them slow enough. I used to laugh at that. Now I listened. Every gust bent the branches back like they were trying to resist something stronger than themselves. Just like I was. Rain started soft, as if testing me. Then it came harder, angrier, beating against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. The wipers squealed in protest. I leaned forward, squinting through the blur, my spine pressed into the seatbelt too tight across my chest. I slowed down. There was no need to rush. There was nothing waiting for me at home but the empty recliner and the sound of the refrigerator. I passed the old mill near Dunmore Hollow. It was half collapsed now, the windows gone, the wooden beams rotted. It used to be a hub of this town. I taught the kids of men who worked there, taught them how to calculate the slope of a conveyor belt, how to estimate velocity before the machines ever moved. Most of them left. Those who stayed now worked night shifts at the warehouse or sat in bars with the ghosts of that mill. The storm had closed over the road now, thick sheets of water hiding the yellow lines. I leaned into the rhythm of the storm, my hands steady, but my chest tight. I remembered Margaret's voice whenever we used to get caught in weather like this. She'd say storms were nature's way of reminding us we're not in charge. She wasn't afraid of thunder. I was. Not of the sound, but of what it drowned out, what it made easier to ignore. The headlights carved a tunnel through the downpour, but everything beyond 10 feet felt like another world, one without time. I thought about my son for a moment, Thomas. He lived 20 minutes away, but called less than that each week, said he was busy, always busy. I stopped asking why. It didn't matter. I had long since learned that asking for someone's attention often meant reminding them they owed you something, and people don't like debts they can't repay. The storm kept building, rising in the sky and crawling into my bones. Every thunderclap felt personal. I turned the radio off. I didn't want music. I didn't want voices. I wanted the storm to speak, to finish what it had started in the sky. I wanted the silence inside me to meet the roar outside and see which one could swallow the other whole. A flash of lightning lit up the road ahead, and for a split second, I saw the shape of a person on the shoulder. Just a blur. I thought maybe it was my mind playing tricks, or maybe it was a branch caught in the wind. But then another flash followed, and this time I saw her clearly. She was standing at the edge of the road, barely upright, her arms curled around something held tight against her chest. A bundle, wrapped in what looked like an old towel or blanket. No umbrella, no coat, just soaked hair and skin. The kind of sight that doesn't leave you. The kind that lodges itself between your ribs and stays there. I pressed the brakes. The tires skidded slightly before catching. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from something else. Something old, protective, reflexive. I hadn't made a sudden decision in years. Everything had been slow, careful, measured. But this was instinct. I shifted into reverse and backed up, my neck straining as I tried to find her again in the side mirror. The rain blurred everything. The world felt undone. When I stopped beside her, she didn't move, just stood there, her eyes half hidden under wet bangs, her arms cradling the bundle like it was the only thing keeping her on this earth. I reached over and unlocked the passenger door, the handle cold against my fingers. The inside light flickered on for a second, casting a dull yellow glow over the leather seat. I waited. The wind howled through the trees. She hesitated, and then she stepped in. The door closed with a dull thud. I smelled rain and skin and something faintly metallic. She didn't look at me. She looked at the dashboard like it might offer answers. The bundle moved slightly, and I heard the softest sound, a baby's breath, a muffled sigh. My throat tightened. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I didn't want to scare her, or myself. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the road. The storm didn't ease up, but something shifted inside me. Something opened. As we drove, the rhythm of the rain became a lullaby, the thunder a fading argument, and the headlights stretched out ahead into a future I hadn't expected. I didn't know her name. I didn't know where she came from, but I knew where we were going. We were going home, or at least to what was left of it. The road ahead remained a blur of headlights slicing through the sheets of rain. I kept both hands on the wheel, the leather slick beneath my palms. The heater blew lukewarm air against the windshield, barely keeping the fog from creeping in. The wipers screeched across the glass with tired rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat cutting through the storm. Inside the cab, the air felt thick with something unspoken. She hadn't said a word since climbing into the truck. I didn't expect her to. Her presence alone had weight, like someone dropped a stone in the middle of a still lake and waited to see where the ripples would reach. Her clothes clung to her skin, soaked through, and her shoulders trembled every so often, not from cold alone. Whatever had brought her to the side of that road hadn't been planned. People don't carry babies through a thunderstorm on purpose. Something had broken in her life, something recent and deep, and it had tossed her out like a piece of driftwood into the current. The baby made a faint cooing sound, almost too soft to notice, and I watched from the corner of my eye as she shifted the bundle slightly, her arms instinctively drawing it closer. She didn't look down, didn't stroke the child's head, or murmur comfort the way mothers often did. She just held it, fiercely and silently, as if the act of holding was the only anchor she had left. I could see the edge of a small pink cap peeking from the folds of the blanket, damp at the corners. The baby looked to be just a few weeks old, tiny, fragile, unfamiliar with the world's harshness, unaware of the rain that lashed against the windows or the tension that filled the truck like fog. My eyes drifted to her face as I navigated a sharp curve in the road. Her jaw was tight, lips slightly parted, her gaze fixed on the dashboard as if it held some truth she needed. Water dripped from the ends of her hair, pooling in the curve of her collarbone. She couldn't have been more than 20, maybe younger. She had the look of someone aged by circumstance, cheeks hollowed by hunger, eyes lined with the beginning of wisdom earned too fast. I didn't ask where she was going. That kind of question can tear open wounds. And besides, I wasn't sure she knew. The way she'd been standing back there, on the shoulder, feet half in the mud, knees locked, she hadn't been waiting for a ride. She'd been standing still because she didn't know where else to go. Some people mistake that for giving up, but I knew better. I'd stood still before, too. Not because I didn't care, because I didn't know which way would hurt less. A gust of wind pushed against the side of the truck, and the vehicle swayed slightly. I steadied it with my hands and eased my foot off the gas. The rain grew louder, hammering the roof with fresh fury. Somewhere ahead, a bolt of lightning lit up the dark, and I saw the outline of pine trees bending low against the wind. The world outside was a place of violence and chaos, but inside the truck, even with the weight of silence, there was at least a roof and warmth and direction. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes briefly. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, like someone learning how to breathe again. I wondered if she'd been walking for hours. I wondered who had let her leave and why no one had come looking. I wondered if she'd always been this quiet, or if the world had forced the quiet into her. I adjusted the rearview mirror and saw nothing behind us but rain and blackness. Whatever road she'd been walking was gone now. The storm had swallowed it. There was no turning back, only forward. The baby let out a soft whimper, and she opened her eyes again. Her gaze darted to me for the first time, a flicker of suspicion, or maybe fear. I didn't meet her stare directly. I kept my eyes on the road and nodded slightly, a gesture without words. I didn't want to break whatever trust had started to form, even if it was built only on the fact that I hadn't asked questions. Sometimes silence is safer than language. As we drove, the hum of the engine and the clatter of rain became our rhythm. I tried to focus on the road, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her. I thought about the girls I used to see in the high school halls. Bright eyes, laughter, that boundless energy. And then I thought about the ones who never finished school, the ones who came back after summer break quieter than before, the ones who wore long sleeves even in September, the ones who carried bags too big for their frames. I'd seen girls like her before, only now she was no longer just a passing face. She was here, next to me, in the cab of my truck, holding a baby, soaked to the bone, and without a destination. The road twisted again, this time descending toward a creek I knew well. It often flooded in storms like this. I slowed down and watched the water rise along the edges, creeping onto the asphalt like fingers. The bridge ahead looked stable, but I didn't take chances. I braked and inched across slowly, the tires hissing against the wet surface. She sat rigid in the seat as we passed over, her eyes now open and alert. Maybe she recognized the danger, or maybe her body had simply grown used to flinching at every turn. Once we cleared the bridge, the land rose again, and I felt the pressure in my ears shift slightly. I adjusted the collar of my jacket and took a deep breath. The heater was working harder now, the windows starting to fog around the edges again. I reached over and cracked mine just enough to let the air circulate. She didn't move. I wanted to offer her something. My coat, a thermos of tea, a blanket, but all of those were at home. I hadn't expected company. I hadn't expected anything that night except to return to my usual chair, heat up a can of soup, and listen to the clock tick until sleep came. But the moment I saw her standing on the shoulder, all of that changed. It wasn't pity. It was instinct. And something deeper. A sense that life, even in its final chapters, sometimes still asks you to open a door. The truck turned down the narrow side road that led toward my property. Trees arched overhead like a canopy, their wet limbs hanging low. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, muffled by mud and water. My porch light glowed dimly in the distance, barely visible through the curtain of rain. I'd left it on out of habit, even when I didn't expect visitors. She shifted slightly in her seat as the truck began to slow, as if sensing we were arriving somewhere. Her hands tightened around the baby, her shoulders tensed. I could feel the uncertainty rising off her like steam. She didn't know if this place was safety or danger. She had no reason to trust it, or me. But she hadn't gotten out. She was still here. I pulled up near the front steps, the tires sinking slightly into the soaked earth. I turned off the engine, and for a moment the silence inside the cab felt louder than the storm outside. She didn't move. Neither did I. The rain tapped against the roof in a steady rhythm, like fingers drumming out a countdown. I exhaled slowly and reached for the door handle. I knew what I had to do, and I knew it wouldn't be as simple as turning a key. Outside, the porch light flickered once in the wind. I looked at her, then at the bundle in her arms, and stepped out into the rain. Rain soaked through the collar of my jacket as soon as I stepped out of the truck. The gravel squelched beneath my boots, the ground soft from the unrelenting storm. I moved slowly, carefully, as though each step toward the porch required permission. The wind slapped at the eaves and whistled through the pine trees lining the property. My porch light, flickering in the storm, cast a sickly yellow circle that didn't quite reach the driveway. It looked weaker than usual, smaller, like it didn't recognize me anymore. The house stood where it always had, but it felt different. Shrunk, guarded, as though it had decided in my absence to become something else, something I no longer belonged to. The siding was damp and streaked with runoff, the windows fogged from inside. I hadn't cleaned the gutters this season. I hadn't fixed the loose shingle above the porch. The house had started to sag under the weight of time and weather, and I had let it. Behind me, the truck door clicked shut. I turned and saw the girl stepping out with the baby in her arms. She moved carefully, hunched against the rain, her shoes sinking into the mud with each step. I waited, unsure what to do with my hands, unsure if I should offer to carry something, unsure what hospitality looked like in a moment like this. I watched her pause beneath the porch overhang, water dripping from her clothes in quiet rivulets. She didn't look at me. She looked at the front door, and I suddenly saw it as she might have seen it, a threshold with no promise. I climbed the steps and stood before the door I had opened thousands of times. My fingers reached into my pocket for the key, but my hand hesitated. It wasn't locked. I had left it open, as I always did when I ran to town. Still, I found myself gripping the key like a token, something to justify my presence. I pushed the door inward, slowly, and the warm breath of the house met the cold air behind me. But it wasn't warmth I felt. It was a stillness that carried weight. The entryway smelled of old wood, stale coffee, and the faintest trace of dust. I had swept last week, or maybe the week before. I couldn't remember anymore. The house no longer marked time the way it once had. It didn't care whether I came or went. It didn't greet me. It merely tolerated my presence. I stepped aside to let her in. She lingered on the threshold. Her eyes darted from the hallway to the ceiling, from the framed photographs on the wall to the coat rack. Her wet sneakers squeaked against the floorboards as she crossed into the room. I shut the door behind her, and for a moment the sound of the rain vanished, replaced by silence so deep it felt like we had been swallowed whole. She stood awkwardly near the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around the baby. I noticed how her eyes avoided the family pictures on the wall. I had never taken them down. There was Margaret, laughing in the garden. There was young Thomas, missing his front teeth, holding a football too big for his hands. The photos felt dusty in spirit, even if they weren't in fact, like memories that had long since decided they didn't need me to survive. I led her into the living room, where the lights were dimmed low and the armchairs sagged in familiar ways. The old knit blanket Margaret had crocheted lay folded over the back of the couch. I hadn't used it in years. It still smelled faintly of lavender and fabric softener. The fireplace sat empty, its grate black with soot from a winter now far behind us. I didn't light it. I didn't move toward it. I stood still, uncertain whether this house still belonged to me, or if I had become a guest in its stubborn bones. She didn't sit. She hovered in the center of the room, shifting her weight, glancing around with wary eyes. The baby stirred, letting out a low, breathy sound, more of a complaint than a cry. I motioned gently toward the armchair nearest the window. She hesitated, then sat, curling her knees inward as if trying to take up as little space as possible. I saw the wetness soaking through the chair cushion, but said nothing. What was a chair, if not a place to be used? I walked into the kitchen, not because I had a plan, but because movement felt safer than stillness. I turned on the kettle, though I wasn't sure if she liked tea. I didn't know if she had eaten. I didn't even know if she had a name. The kettle hissed softly, its steam rising in slow spirals. I watched it, and let the sound fill the space in my head, where questions wanted to form. The kitchen hadn't changed in 20 years. The same yellow tile, the same scratched linoleum, the same old spice rack with tins that had outlived their flavor. I touched the back of one of the chairs at the table. It rocked slightly beneath my hand. Margaret used to keep a journal at that table. I used to grade papers. We'd eat meals together, facing the window, talking about nothing. Now the table was bare. No crumbs, no mail. Just a worn wood surface surrounded by chairs with no names. When the kettle whistled, I poured 2 cups. I brought one into the living room, set it gently on the end table near her, and placed the other near my own chair. She didn't reach for it. I didn't press her. The steam lifted in thin lines and then vanished. I sank into my chair and felt the familiar give of the cushion beneath me. My bones ached from the storm, from the weight of time, from the way silence pressed down on the chest when shared with someone new. I didn't speak. She didn't either. But the air between us had changed. It had texture now. The house felt it too. I noticed how the light from the lamp cast her shadow on the wall. Long, thin, fragile. The baby's head rested against her collarbone, and one small hand poked out from the blanket, curled into a soft fist. That image stayed with me. It belonged to this room now, to this house, whether the house wanted it or not. I could hear the rain outside picking up again, drumming harder against the roof. The wind made the windows creak. Somewhere upstairs, the old floorboards groaned, as if remembering footsteps that no longer walked them. The house was reacting, not welcoming, not resisting, just adjusting. I sat there, watching the steam fade from my cup, and thought about what it meant to live somewhere for 50 years, to watch your own name fade from the walls, to become part of the furniture, to wonder if your presence meant anything anymore to the space that once held your laughter. The girl sat still. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't explain. She simply held her child and waited. Not for answers, just for a moment of stillness in a life that had clearly known too little of it. And I understood then, perhaps more clearly than ever, that sometimes a house stops being yours, not because you leave it, but because it stops waiting for you to return. I stood at the base of the staircase, holding the rail like it might steady something deeper than my legs. The house hummed quietly around me, that particular stillness that came only after the rain had slowed, like the air itself was exhausted. I looked toward the hallway, toward the closed door near the kitchen, the one with chipped paint along the bottom edge from years of being nudged open by Margaret's foot when her hands were full. Behind that door was Thomas, my son. He had arrived earlier that afternoon, unannounced, as he often did when it suited him, claiming he needed to check on things, to help with something, though there was little left to help with. I hadn't told him I was leaving the house that evening. I hadn't told him much of anything in recent months. Our conversations had grown shallow and brief, mostly logistical. Utilities, groceries, occasional reminders from him about the safety of getting someone in to assist. But I didn't need help, not in the way he meant. What I needed was something he had forgotten how to offer. Space. Quiet. A reason to be more than a shadow drifting between rooms. And now, with the girl and her baby wrapped in my quilt and sitting in my chair, I felt the weight of a decision I hadn't fully realized I was making. I walked down the hallway, the wooden floor whispering beneath my feet, and placed my hand on the doorframe. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. He had heard us come in. I opened the door slowly. The warm light of the guest room spilled into the hall. He stood near the window, arms crossed, looking out at the driveway. He didn't turn around when I entered. I watched his shoulders tighten. He must have seen her, or maybe just the shape of her through the rain, her arms cradling the baby, my figure beside her. The porch light would have cast us in silhouette, two strangers where he expected solitude. I could feel the judgment before he spoke a word. He turned slowly and met my eyes. His face was calm, carefully so, but his jaw held tension. That tightness he always carried when something didn't align with the way he thought things should be. I opened my mouth, then closed it. There was no language that would soften what was about to happen, no explanation that would change his stance. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, and I knew he wanted to walk past me, to see for himself, to confront. But he waited. That was worse. That meant he expected me to choose. I stepped back and motioned toward the living room. He followed, his footsteps heavy on the boards. The girl had stood up, the baby still sleeping in her arms, her back to the window. She turned as we entered, her eyes wide and alert. Thomas stopped in the doorway. He took her in, piece by piece, his gaze calculating. Then his face settled into something cold, something final. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The silence that passed between us was sharper than any accusation. He looked at me with the kind of disappointment that wraps itself in righteousness, as if I had betrayed an agreement he thought we shared, an understanding that this house, this life, this version of me, no longer made room for the unpredictable, for the vulnerable, for strangers. I watched his lips tighten. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he turned around and walked back down the hallway. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of that gesture sinking into the floor beneath my feet. The girl didn't move. I didn't move. The storm outside had quieted to a soft tapping, and yet something louder roared inside me. I followed him, back to the threshold. He stood by the front door now, his hand resting on the knob, his back turned to me again. I waited behind him, my chest tight. When he finally turned, he looked me in the eyes one last time, then pulled the door open and stepped out into the night, without a word. The rain had slowed to a mist. His figure disappeared into it. I stood in the open doorway, the threshold gaping before me, and listened to the sound of his car starting, then pulling away, tires spitting gravel. The red of his taillights vanished into the trees. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. I closed the door slowly, sealing the air inside again. When I turned back toward the hallway, the girl was still standing in the same place. The baby slept on her shoulder, unaware of the silence that had just swallowed the room. She looked at me, not with fear, not with questions, but with that same guarded uncertainty. I nodded once, slowly, and she sat down again, adjusting the blanket around the child's legs. I remained by the door for a while, one hand still on the knob. My heart beat slow and hard. The house had spoken in a way, or perhaps I had spoken through it. Either way, a line had been drawn, a threshold crossed, one I couldn't uncross. There's something about thresholds, how they hold both promise and warning, how they divide what is from what was. That night, as I stood there in the stillness, I knew something in me had shifted. The house hadn't changed. The walls remained the same. The floor creaked just as it always had. But I was no longer only its keeper. I was now its gate. I walked back into the living room, the soft light casting long shadows on the rug. The girl had leaned back in the chair again, her eyes closed, her breath even. The baby stirred faintly, one hand unfurling against her collarbone. I sat across from them and folded my hands in my lap. Beyond the windows, the rain became a whisper, the kind that came only after the storm had said everything it needed to say. I woke before the light. It had become a habit, rising while the sky was still a dark smear over the trees, while the world outside remained quiet and undecided. The house breathed softly around me, the old walls holding on to the last remnants of the storm. I could still hear the gentle dripping of rain from the eaves, water sliding down gutters, falling onto the soft earth below in slow, consistent beats. It wasn't the kind of rain that threatened. It was the kind that lingered, the kind that reminded you something had passed through. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened. No footsteps overhead, no voices in the hallway, just the hush of a house holding its breath. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the lines that had deepened with the years, the skin looser around the jaw, the morning stiffness in my joints. I moved slowly, always slowly now. There was no one waiting, no schedule to race toward. And yet that morning felt different, not in a loud way, in the way a room feels after someone has wept in it. I dressed in silence and made my way down the stairs, my hand grazing the rail as I descended. The wood was smooth under my fingers, familiar. The grooves and creaks of the staircase had once been part of the music of my life. Now they sounded like an old song I couldn't quite remember the words to. In the kitchen, the air was cool. I reached for the kettle, filled it with water, and set it on the stove. My movements were automatic, the kind that had been rehearsed over decades. I didn't need to think about where the tea was, or which mug I preferred. Everything was in its place, as if waiting for someone to come back and pick up the rhythm, but no one ever did. I stood by the window while the water heated, watching the light edge slowly into the sky. The trees outside still shimmered with rain, their leaves heavy, their limbs drooping. Puddles lined the gravel path, and beyond them, the grass bent under the weight of the night. The girl and her baby were still asleep in the living room. I had passed by quietly, seen them curled together in the armchair, the blanket draped across both their shoulders. She had shifted in her sleep, the baby pressed tight against her chest, as if the storm could still reach them. But it was behind us now, mostly. The kettle whistled, soft at first, then louder. I turned off the flame and poured the water, watching the steam rise in thin trails. I carried my cup to the kitchen table and sat down, slowly. The chair creaked beneath me. I traced the grain in the wood with my finger, letting my thoughts gather themselves. I didn't know her name. She hadn't offered it. I hadn't asked. I only knew the look she carried, one of exhaustion, of fight long since stretched thin, of questions that could no longer be asked aloud. I had seen that look in the mirror before, not in the same shape, perhaps, but in the same silence. Thomas hadn't returned. He hadn't called. His reaction the night before had left a hollow in the house, a kind of spiritual draft that no blanket could warm. I could still feel it as I sat there, the way he had looked at me, the space he had placed between us. He had walked out with the storm, and neither had looked back. I heard a small rustle from the living room. Not loud, just the sound of someone adjusting in their seat, of fabric moving, of breath stretching into waking. I remained where I was. I didn't want to crowd her. The house would move at her pace now, not mine. After some time, she stepped into the doorway. Her hair was slightly matted, her eyes still heavy with sleep. The baby was nestled against her, wrapped tight, a tiny fist poking out from the edge of the blanket. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. I stood slowly, gestured toward the kitchen table, then moved back toward the counter to prepare another cup of tea. She sat down without hesitation, as if some part of her had finally accepted the chair, the table, the house itself. It wasn't comfort. It was surrender. And in that surrender, there was a strange sort of peace. I poured the tea and placed the cup before her. She nodded once, a small motion that said more than words. We sat there for a long time. The rain tapered off, leaving only the sound of droplets sliding from leaves, the wind nudging the trees in slow movements. I watched the light shift across the kitchen floor, pooling against the cupboards, then crawling toward the rug. The house exhaled quietly, like an old man relieved that the fight had passed. I thought about the threshold again, about how thin the line had been. One night. One choice. I could have driven past her. I could have kept going, pretending not to see. I could have returned to my armchair, to my silence, to my waiting. But I hadn't. And now there was someone breathing softly at my kitchen table. Someone who needed shelter, not questions. There was a knock at the door just after noon, not loud, hesitant. I stood, my joints aching slightly from the morning stillness, and made my way down the hallway. I opened the door slowly and found my neighbor, Edith, standing on the porch with a covered dish in her hands. She looked past me into the hallway, then back at me, her eyes sharp but kind. She didn't ask anything. She didn't need to. She handed me the dish, said she had made too much soup, and that it wouldn't keep long. Then she turned and walked back toward her truck. I watched her drive away before closing the door. I placed the dish on the counter, lifted the lid, and let the steam rise into the room. The smell was rich and familiar. Chicken, carrots, a hint of thyme. I ladled 2 bowls and brought them to the table. The girl ate slowly, carefully, her eyes never leaving the child. She held the spoon with one hand and kept the other on the baby's back, rubbing soft circles. I ate my soup and said nothing. When the meal was finished, she stood and took her bowl to the sink. She rinsed it without being asked. Then she turned and looked at me, not with gratitude, not with pleading, just a look of quiet recognition, as if she understood that we had both stepped into a space neither of us had expected to share. The rain had stopped completely by then. The clouds had lifted slightly, enough for thin sunlight to press through the kitchen window. I felt it on my face, warm and pale. Behind us, the storm was gone, but its weight remained in the soil, in the trees, in the dampness of the walls, and in us. But somehow, the silence had softened. It no longer echoed. It rested. And in that stillness, with the rain finally behind us, something new began to grow. Not loudly, not quickly, but surely, like the faint scent of wet earth after a long, hard night. That afternoon, I walked to the edge of the property where the old tool shed stood, half collapsed on one side, like a man too tired to hold his weight. It had been years since I used it for anything other than storing rusted nails and weather-warped planks, but I knew it still had a roof and walls. The house, for all its memory and warmth, had begun to feel too exposed, not to the weather, but to something more fragile, more personal. There was a weight to sharing your space, especially when you hadn't been asked to in so long. A house can absorb grief and hold it like a sponge, and when someone new walks through that, sometimes it overflows. She didn't say anything when I told her about the shed. She didn't argue. There was no protest in her eyes, no suspicion, just a silent understanding that space was not something you demanded, it was something you were offered. I walked with her across the soft ground, damp from days of rain. The baby was quiet in her arms, wrapped tightly in a blanket that had begun to fray at the edges. The path behind the house was uneven. The grass had grown long, brushing against our shins, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine. I hadn't tended that part of the yard in months, maybe years, but the shed still stood. It always had. Its boards were weathered, its hinges rusted, and one corner of the roof bowed inward, but it remained upright. Like me, it had survived by simply staying in place. I opened the door slowly. The inside smelled of dust and wood, of iron and soil. I stepped in first, checking the floor for weakness, brushing aside the cobwebs that hung low from the beams. Light filtered in through the slats in narrow lines, stripes of gold cutting through the dark. I turned and watched her enter. She paused at the threshold, then stepped in carefully, adjusting the baby against her shoulder. There was an old cot folded against the far wall, left there from summers long ago when Thomas used to play camp with the neighborhood boys. I unfolded it, wiped the dust from the fabric, and set it near the small window that faced east. The wind crept in through a crack near the door, but it wasn't cruel. It was soft, almost gentle. I brought her a lantern, an extra blanket, a small tin of crackers from the pantry. I placed them in a corner of the shed without saying anything. She sat on the cot and looked around the space, not with judgment or complaint, but with the eyes of someone who had slept in worse places. The baby made a sound like a sigh, and she cradled him closer, rocking gently without rhythm. I returned to the house, my footsteps slower on the way back. The door closed behind me with a dull thud, and I stood for a long moment in the kitchen, the silence wrapping around me like an old coat. The house felt different, not emptier, just quieter in a new way. The kind of quiet that came when you no longer needed to fill the space with noise to prove you were alive. That evening, I lit a fire in the living room, not because it was cold, but because the house needed to remember warmth. The crackle of the logs, the scent of burning cedar, the soft flicker of orange light. It brought something back. I sat in my chair and watched the flames move like dancers behind the grate. The walls no longer pressed in on me. They simply stood. Before bed, I stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the shed. I could see the faint glow of the lantern through the cracks in the wood. It flickered slightly, but it held. Just like her. The night passed slowly. I woke twice to the sound of wind brushing the windows, once to the memory of Margaret's voice in a dream I couldn't fully remember. By dawn, the clouds had broken, and the sky stretched pale and blue over the treetops. I boiled water and prepared 2 cups of tea, one for me, one for her. I carried the cup outside, careful not to spill. The grass still shimmered with dew, and the soles of my boots left soft impressions in the earth. I knocked once on the door of the shed and waited. A moment later, it opened. She stood in the doorway, hair tangled from sleep, eyes wary but awake. The baby was still wrapped tight, breathing softly against her chest. I handed her the cup, and she took it without a word. She didn't smile. Neither did I. But in that moment, the space between us changed. I turned and walked back toward the house, the sun now breaking over the tree line, casting long shadows across the yard. The wind moved through the branches above, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace, exactly, but something adjacent to it. A quiet that didn't ache. That day, I worked in the yard. I cleared out the dead branches along the fence, hauled the broken chair from behind the shed, and stacked the firewood that had collapsed in the rain. I worked until my back stiffened and the skin on my hands turned raw. I hadn't done that kind of labor in years, but it didn't feel like labor. It felt like offering. At midday, I left a basket on the steps of the shed, clean towels, a bar of soap, a pair of Margaret's old slippers. I didn't wait for her to find them. I just returned to the porch and sat, the old wood groaning beneath me, and watched the wind roll across the grass. She emerged later, barefoot, carrying the baby in one arm and the basket in the other. She walked toward the house slowly, as if testing each step. I opened the door before she could knock. She didn't enter. She just nodded once, then stepped toward the back, where I had set up a line for laundry and left a basin filled with warm water from the kettle. She washed the baby first, gently, with the kind of care that came from instinct, then herself. I stayed inside, giving her privacy, but I watched through the kitchen window. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, not desperate, not hurried, just present. By sunset, the sky glowed orange and pink, and the yard smelled of wet earth and fresh air. She returned to the shed, the baby clean and calm in her arms. The lantern flickered to life once more, and the day slipped quietly into night. In the silence that followed, I sat by the window, my hands folded in my lap, and I thought about how strange it was to feel useful again, to offer without demand, to give space and warmth without asking for gratitude. The house had not changed, but the quiet inside it had, and in that quiet, something had begun to grow. Not loudly, not quickly, but deeply, like roots in the dark, reaching for a place to hold. The morning air carried a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. The sky was pale and cloudless, washed clean by the rain, and the earth beneath my feet felt soft but grounded, like it had absorbed the storm and somehow steadied itself because of it. I stood on the back porch, one hand resting on the rail, a chipped enamel mug warming my fingers. The tea had already gone tepid, but I held it anyway. I wasn't drinking it for comfort. I held it because the weight reminded me I was still here. Out beyond the porch, the shed stood silent. There was no movement inside yet. The curtain I had tacked over the small window hadn't stirred. I knew she was in there, curled with her child, wrapped in the blanket I had left. They didn't need anything from me this morning. Or maybe they did, but had learned not to ask. That was what lingered in the air between us, the presence of need without the noise of it. I understood that language. I had lived in it for years. I turned from the yard and stepped back inside. The house greeted me in its usual silence. The floor creaked, the light shifted across the walls, and the clock in the hallway ticked steadily, counting seconds as if they mattered. I moved through the kitchen, rinsed the mug, wiped the counter, and opened the window just slightly to let in the breeze. I had always preferred houses with windows that opened wide. Margaret used to say that air needed to move or it would die. She would open every window in spring, even when the mornings were still cool, and let the curtains flutter like flags in the wind. Now I opened only one, and even that felt like a ceremony. I made toast and sat at the table, chewing slowly, the crust rough against my teeth. I thought about Thomas, and how often he used to sit across from me at this very table, his legs swinging beneath the chair when he was small, his mouth full of questions. He used to ask why toast tasted better when it was cut into triangles, or how clouds made rain, or if people stopped loving you if you forgot their birthday. I always had an answer, even when I didn't. That's what fathers did. Now I hadn't heard his voice in days. The last time he visited, he had walked into the house like a man inspecting a property he might one day sell. He had spoken in short sentences, had glanced at the corners of the room like they offended him, had said the shed needed to come down and that the porch rail was beginning to rot. He had spoken of the house as if I weren't inside it, as if it were a burden left behind for him to manage. He hadn't asked about the chair Margaret used to sit in. He hadn't noticed the tea set I had cleaned. He had asked if I had considered options. That was his way of asking if I was ready to leave. But I wasn't. Not yet. Not while the shed held someone who had nowhere else to go. Not while I still woke with a purpose, even if it was just to boil water and carry it across the yard. I stood and washed my plate, wiped down the sink, and walked slowly to the front room. The armchair by the window had become my station. From there I could see the gravel drive, the mailbox, the stretch of trees beyond the fence. I sat and listened. A bird chirped somewhere high above, breaking the quiet just long enough to remind me the world had not ended. By late morning, I heard the shed door open. I didn't look out the window. I didn't need to. I knew her steps already. The cautious crunch of boots on grass. The weight of someone who had learned to move without taking up space. I listened as she crossed the yard and came up the back steps. I heard the faucet on the side of the house turn on. I heard water splash into a basin. I heard the baby cry softly, then quiet. I stayed seated. Fathers, I had learned, could vanish while sitting perfectly still. It was not always a matter of leaving. Sometimes it was a matter of becoming so unnoticed that even your presence disappeared. I had become that kind of father, not because I had intended to, not because I didn't love my son, but because over time, something had hollowed between us. Something had been worn thin. The fabric of our closeness had stretched until it was see-through, until we stopped seeing each other altogether. I wondered if he ever thought about that, if he sat in his house, wherever it was, and remembered how I used to stand in the yard with a flashlight when he came home late from football practice, how I stayed awake until I heard the door click shut, how I used to place my hand on his shoulder during dinner, not to correct him, but just to feel the weight of his presence. Now I stood alone on this porch, my hand resting on wood instead of a shoulder, my words swallowed before they ever reached a room. In the afternoon, I took a bag of flour from the pantry, rolled up my sleeves, and made biscuits the way Margaret used to. I moved slowly, careful with the dough, measuring by memory rather than recipe. The kitchen filled with the scent of butter and salt, and for a moment, the room felt alive again. I wrapped a few biscuits in a towel and placed them in a basket. I added a jar of honey, a spoon, and a folded cloth napkin. I carried it to the shed and left it by the door. She must have heard me, but she didn't come out. I didn't wait. I returned to the house and sat on the porch with my hands in my lap, watching the light shift across the yard. The breeze had picked up. Leaves rustled. A crow called once, then disappeared into the trees. In the evening, I watched the lantern glow through the shed window again. A thin flickering light, steady despite the wind. I thought about all the nights I had stayed up when Thomas was sick as a boy, how I had sat beside his bed, counting breaths, brushing his damp hair from his forehead, how I had hummed tuneless songs to keep him asleep. I remembered the quiet of those nights, the weight of responsibility, the fragile, terrified love that filled the room like air. And now here I was, a man in a house with no child, no wife, no voice loud enough to fill the hallways. I didn't miss the noise. I missed the recognition, the sense that someone saw me, needed me, believed I held the shape of something reliable. But I was invisible now. A man with his hands folded. A man who carried baskets to doorways and left them without knocking. Still, when the sun slipped behind the trees and the first stars pressed through the sky like pinholes, I felt something soften inside me. I felt the edges of that invisibility begin to curve, not into absence, but into quiet purpose. And sometimes I thought, that was enough. It started with a shadow, long, thin, stretching across the edge of the yard in the mid-afternoon light. I noticed it first through the kitchen window as I rinsed out a mug. A figure had stopped by the fence line, not moving, just standing in the space where the hedges ended and the view of the old shed opened wide. The sun had already begun its slow descent toward the western treetops, casting the kind of golden slant that sharpened everything it touched. The shape wasn't unfamiliar. Even before I stepped outside, I knew who it was. Edith Martin had lived next door for nearly 3 decades. We'd been neighbors for as long as I could remember, ever since she and her late husband bought the old farmhouse with the ivy-covered chimney and painted it blue, though the paint had long since peeled. She was a quiet woman by nature, but not in the same way I had become quiet. Her silence came with eyes that saw everything, not nosy, not cruel, just aware, like someone who had watched too many seasons pass not to notice when something shifted in the air. She didn't wave when I approached. She just nodded once, her hands folded in front of her, her chin slightly lifted. I met her at the fence and rested my hand on the top post. We didn't speak. That was the kind of neighbors we were. Words had always been second to presence. She looked past me, toward the shed. The door was closed. No movement. The curtain in the window barely stirred. Still, I felt the tension coil gently between us, like the first vibration of a string pulled too tight. I didn't offer an explanation. She didn't ask. But I could feel her questions settling into the space between us like dust. I remembered years ago, when Edith's oldest son got into a fight at school, and she had stood in this very spot, shoulders squared, voice low, as she told me she'd handle it herself. No intervention, no calls, no panic, just quiet authority. She had carried that same energy now, not judgment, not suspicion, just a watchfulness that had matured over years of knowing when to step in and when to wait. She turned and walked back toward her house without a word, but her shadow lingered in my mind long after she disappeared. That evening, I found a basket on my porch. Inside were 3 mason jars of soup, lentil, chicken with rice, and tomato basil, each labeled in Edith's careful handwriting. Beneath them, a folded dish towel and a small brown bag of cornbread muffins still slightly warm to the touch. I stood there for a moment, holding the basket, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was acknowledgement, the kind that said, "I see what you're doing. I don't need to know everything, but I see." I brought the basket into the kitchen, placed the jars carefully in the refrigerator, and warmed one of the muffins. I cut it in half, added a pat of butter, and watched it melt while the house settled into its evening rhythm. I ate slowly, my thoughts elsewhere. The light outside faded, and the porch light buzzed to life on its own timer. I didn't switch it off. The next morning, I noticed a second shadow. This time it was shorter, quicker. From the corner of my eye, I caught sight of a young man, maybe late teens, walking along the far edge of the property, near where the old fence dipped down and the brush grew wild. He wasn't close enough to be on my land, but close enough to see. He paused, looked toward the shed, then kept walking. I stood on the porch, mug in hand, and waited until he disappeared behind the bend in the road. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't from around here. Or if he was, he belonged to one of the newer families that had bought up the farmland and built prefab homes with vinyl siding and 3-car garages. The girl in the shed didn't mention him. But that night, when I brought over another bundle, this time with canned peaches and a clean towel, her eyes held something more alert. Not afraid, not panicked, just aware. I nodded and left the bundle by the door. Days passed. Edith didn't return, but I noticed small signs that she was watching. A newspaper that hadn't been collected was suddenly gone. A set of footprints in the mud near the fence line. Once I spotted her curtains shifting as I stepped onto the porch. Her presence remained, like a gentle pressure in the air. Not oppressive, not unwelcome. Just there. The girl and her baby stayed in the shed. She ventured out only in the early mornings and late evenings. Sometimes I saw her walking the perimeter of the yard, the baby in her arms, her movements slow and steady. Once I left a basket of herbs from the garden on the shed steps. Rosemary, mint, basil. and later saw them tied in small bundles above the window inside, drying in the afternoon sun. It became a rhythm. I brought what I could: food, blankets, soap, water. She accepted without thanks, and I offered without expectation. The house no longer felt heavy with absence. The walls didn't echo the same way. Something in the air had shifted, like the house itself had decided to stay awake. One afternoon, I found a small piece of paper folded on the porch. No envelope, just a note, written in pencil, the handwriting neat but tentative. 3 words. "Thank you anyway." I read it 3 times before folding it again and sliding it into my shirt pocket. I didn't mention it. I didn't bring it up the next time I brought firewood to the shed or filled the water basin. But I felt it settle somewhere deep in my chest. Not a wound, not a balm, something in between. Edith never asked me directly what was happening, but her presence, her shadow, had given me more than I realized. She had seen, and she had allowed it to continue. In this town, that mattered more than permission. One evening, I saw her again by the fence, just before dusk. She nodded once, then looked toward the shed and said nothing. I nodded in return. That was all. Not every witness is a threat. Some are reminders that what you're doing, however quiet, is still seen, still understood. The light dimmed behind the hills, and I returned to the porch, listening to the slow, steady hum of insects rising with the dark. The world outside had changed shape again, just slightly, enough to notice. Inside, the clock ticked. The walls held their breath, and across the yard, the lantern flickered to life once more. It was tucked away in the bottom drawer of the hallway desk, beneath a stack of unpaid bills, expired coupons, and curled envelopes from birthdays long past. I hadn't opened that drawer in months, maybe longer. I had gone looking for something else entirely. A flashlight, I think. But my hand landed on the soft, familiar cover and froze. I recognized it by touch before I even saw it. The spine was worn, the edges frayed. It had once been a rich navy blue, but now looked closer to gray. The color faded from time and heat and hands. I carried it into the kitchen without a word, without knowing why, and sat at the table with the notebook resting in front of me, like a closed memory. The room was quiet, the light shifting through the curtains in slow waves, and I let my fingers rest on the cover for a long time. I had bought that notebook years ago, when the school district switched from chalkboards to dry erase, when the walls of my classroom were still lined with multiplication charts and motivational posters. Back then, I used it to jot things down, quotes from students, lesson plans, reminders to fix the broken drawer in the back cabinet. But somewhere along the way, it had become something else. A place for thoughts I didn't say out loud, observations, moments, not poetry, not quite journaling, just pieces of myself I hadn't wanted to lose. I opened to the first page. The handwriting surprised me, not the shape of it. I recognized the slow, looping strokes, the slight rightward slant, but the steadiness of it. My hands had been stronger then, my mind sharper. I flipped through the pages slowly, the ink fading in some places, smudged in others. I saw notes about weather, about Margaret's garden, about the first time Thomas rode his bike without training wheels, scribbles about arguments I barely remembered, lines that didn't form sentences, dates with no events. One page caught my eye. February 9th. No year. Just a sentence written at the center of the page. She left the radio on so the house wouldn't notice she was gone. I stared at that line for a long time. I didn't remember writing it, but it sounded like me. It sounded like something I would have thought but never said. Margaret used to do that. Leave the kitchen radio on when she stepped out to water the plants or walk to the mailbox. I used to think it was silly. Now I understood. Silence is a dangerous thing when it knows you're alone. Later that afternoon, I walked out to the shed with the notebook in my hand. The sky was soft and overcast. the kind of light that erases shadows but doesn't bring warmth. I knocked gently, waited, then opened the door. She sat on the cot, legs tucked under her, the baby asleep beside her in a bundle of blankets. She looked up as I stepped in, but didn't speak. I held out the notebook. She hesitated. Her eyes flicked from the cover to my face, then back again. After a moment, she reached for it. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. She took it carefully, as if it were fragile, and turned it over in her hands. I stepped back, gave her space, and left the shed without looking back. That night, I sat on the porch longer than usual. The sky had cleared, and the stars blinked weakly above the tree line. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and pine. I thought about what was in that notebook. Nothing private, nothing incriminating, just pieces, a mosaic of days that had slipped through my fingers. Maybe that was why I gave it to her, not because she needed to know about my life, but because she was living through something unspoken too. And maybe silence is less sharp when it's shared. The next morning, I saw the notebook resting on the porch bench. I hadn't heard her leave it. It sat there like a quiet reply. I picked it up and opened to a page near the back. Her handwriting was different than mine. Tighter, cleaner, but hesitant. Like someone writing in a language they hadn't spoken in a while. There were only a few lines. My mother used to braid my hair so tight I couldn't cry. She said girls who cry get left behind. I never asked what happened to her. I read the words 3 times before I closed the notebook. I didn't know what to do with that kind of truth. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a plea. It was just a fact, dropped between us like a stone in water. And I knew better than to throw a rope across that kind of silence. I left the notebook on the bench again that night. The next day, it returned. New pages filled. One entry was dated. One wasn't. One page just had a sketch of a tree. Another had a shopping list written entirely in past tense. Milk, when I had a fridge. Bread, before I knew I could do without. Apples, when he still said my name. It became a rhythm, a conversation without voices. She would write. I would read. Sometimes I left a sentence or two of my own. We had a dog once. She used to sleep on my feet. Now my feet are always cold. I didn't know if she laughed when she read it. I didn't need to know. One morning, I found the notebook wrapped in the same towel I had given her during the first rain. She had stitched a button onto the towel's edge and used a shoelace to tie it closed like a cover. The notebook had changed. It looked worn, used, cared for. It belonged to both of us now. That afternoon, I built a shelf inside the shed. Nothing fancy, just a piece of pine board nailed into the wall, wide enough for the notebook to rest on, next to the small lantern and the tin of crackers. When I set the notebook down on it, I felt something settle in my chest, like I had handed over a piece of myself, and it had found a home. Some stories aren't told out loud. They are left in notebooks. They are written in silence. They are folded between pages and stitched into towels and passed back and forth until the weight of loneliness is evenly distributed. That night, I sat by the window and stared at the place where the stars flickered above the shed. I thought about all the words we carry, all the ones we bury, all the ones we hope someone, someday, will read and not turn away from. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer pressed. It listened. It waited. And across the yard, the notebook waited too, open, half-filled, and not yet finished. It started in the early morning hours, just before the sun had begun to press through the trees. I woke without knowing why. The room was still, the air unusually dense. Something in the quiet was wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't shout, doesn't crash, but hums beneath the ribs like a warning. I sat up slowly, letting the stiffness in my back catch up with me, and listened. The house made its usual sounds, timid groans from old beams, a soft ticking from the wall clock. But beyond the walls, I felt something pulling. I stepped into my boots without lacing them, pulled on my flannel shirt, and opened the back door. The yard was gray with mist, the grass damp beneath my soles. The shed stood in place, silent as ever. But the door was open. Just slightly. That was enough. I crossed the lawn with quickened steps, a tightness forming behind my ribs. When I reached the threshold, I found her sitting on the cot, her back hunched, the baby in her lap. The lantern was still burning, casting a pale glow over her face. She looked up slowly when I entered, and what I saw in her eyes made something inside me break. Not panic, not fear, something worse. Helplessness. The child was burning. I could see it from across the room. His skin was flushed, slick with sweat, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven motions. The air inside the shed was thick with heat and worry. She held him too tightly, as if her arms alone could pull the fever out of him. I knelt down beside her without thinking. My hands hovered, unsure. I could feel the heat radiating from the infant like a small sun, not warm, but angry, disoriented, unnatural. I reached for a towel, dipped it in the water basin by the door, and began to dab gently at his forehead. He didn't cry. That was what frightened me most. His eyes fluttered, then closed, and a weak sound, more breath than voice, escaped his lips. She stared at me, waiting for an answer I didn't have. I didn't give her one. I just stood and went back to the house. Inside, I moved with the precision of memory. I opened the drawer beneath the sink, found the old metal tin with the faded red cross on the lid. Margaret had kept it stocked for years. I hadn't touched it since she passed. My fingers trembled slightly as I removed the thermometer, the fever medicine, the alcohol wipes. I searched the cabinet above the stove for the bottle of children's ibuprofen I remembered buying for a neighbor's granddaughter last summer. I didn't know if it had expired. I didn't care. When I returned to the shed, the girl was rocking slightly, her arms wrapped around the baby. I handed her the thermometer. She understood immediately. She slid it gently beneath the child's arm and held him close. We waited in silence. The seconds stretched thin, heavy with weight. When she removed it, she handed it to me. 103. Too high for someone so small. I pressed the back of my hand to his neck. He was burning from the inside out. I poured the medicine into the cap and handed it to her. She coaxed it into the baby's mouth with careful fingers. He swallowed weakly, barely responding. I began to open the windows of the shed to let the air circulate. It was already stifling. The sun hadn't even risen fully, and yet the heat inside the shed clung to us like fevered breath. I stepped out, filled the basin with cold water from the pump, and returned with cloths soaked through. We worked in silence. I held the baby while she cooled his skin. When her hands began to shake, I took over. She sat on the floor beside the cot, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes distant, but not vacant. She wasn't crying. She had passed the point of tears. There was only endurance now. The hours passed slowly. The fever held its grip like a clenched fist. I measured time in breaths, in spoonfuls of water, in the tilt of the sun as it climbed over the trees. I didn't leave. I didn't check my phone. I didn't look for Thomas. There was no one else. Just us and this child who hadn't asked for any of this but bore it anyway. At some point, I remembered something Margaret once told me, years ago, when Thomas was small and sick in bed with scarlet fever. She said, "Sometimes the body fights so hard to survive, it forgets how to ask for help." That line returned to me now, echoing in the tight space between the walls of the shed. I looked down at the baby, his lips dry, his face flushed, and whispered to no one in particular, "Not yet." In the late afternoon, the fever broke, not with drama, not with relief, just a slow shift in temperature. His skin, which had been radiating fire, began to cool. His breathing deepened. His fingers, once curled in tight fists, relaxed against the edge of the blanket. He let out a sigh, a real one this time, and his eyes opened for a moment before fluttering shut again. She noticed it first. Her posture changed, her shoulders dropping slightly. She reached out and touched his cheek. It was still warm, but no longer frightening. She didn't say anything. I didn't either. But in that shared silence, something passed between us. Not gratitude, not relief, just something old and real and human. I stepped outside and let the screen door fall closed behind me. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows across the yard. I walked to the pump, filled a basin with clean water, and splashed some on my face. The coldness startled me. I realized I hadn't eaten all day. I returned to the house and opened a can of soup. I warmed it slowly on the stove, watching the steam rise, listening to the gentle bubbling. I poured 2 bowls, found 2 spoons, wrapped a loaf of bread in a clean cloth, and carried everything back to the shed. When I opened the door, she was sitting in the corner, the baby asleep beside her on the cot. She looked up when I entered, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but softer now. I placed the tray near her and stepped back. She nodded. Not a thank you, not a gesture of dependence, just a nod of recognition, a wordless echo of what we had endured together. I sat outside the shed for a long while after. The wind moved gently through the grass. A hawk circled high above the treetops. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, and then fell quiet. I watched the sky change colors, the blue deepening into indigo, the stars pressing into view one by one. And there, beneath the darkening sky, I realized something I hadn't said aloud in years. I had once believed that love was something you gave to people who stayed, to those who promised to be there. But now, watching the light from the lantern flicker against the wood of the shed, I knew different. Sometimes love was what you did when there was no promise, no future, no name, just the fragile weight of life in your hands and the silence that asked if you would carry it anyway. And I had. We both had. Together. The morning after the fever broke, the world looked unchanged. The sky wore its usual gray, and the trees moved gently in the late spring breeze. But something in me had shifted. I moved slower that day, not out of fatigue, but out of a strange reverence, like the air was thicker, more fragile, and I didn't want to disturb it. I boiled water, swept the kitchen floor, folded towels I didn't remember washing. I kept busy. I didn't know what else to do. At midday, I walked to the shed with a bowl of warm porridge, mashed soft, and a little jar of applesauce I had found at the back of the pantry. She opened the door before I knocked. Her face was pale, but calm. The baby was resting on the cot beside her, breathing steady, cheeks pink again, but this time from life, not heat. She accepted the food without a word. I nodded and stepped back, letting her return to her new, fragile rhythm. The door closed gently behind me. I lingered outside longer than I meant to, staring at the shed's roofline, at the little window and the lantern hanging just inside. I realized I didn't feel like I was rescuing anyone anymore. I felt like I was standing in something bigger than rescue, something quiet, shared, and inexplicable. That afternoon, I sat in the front room with a stack of envelopes spread across my lap. Bills mostly, a few credit card offers, one letter from the hospital addressed to Margaret, though she had been gone for 3 years. I didn't open it. I simply placed it in the metal tray I kept near the fireplace, the one I used to call the deal with later box. It had become a sort of paper graveyard, things I couldn't throw away, but didn't want to face. I stood up to stretch and caught sight of myself in the window. At first I didn't realize it was me. The sunlight hit the glass at such an angle that the reflection felt like a ghost, a faded man in a loose shirt, slightly hunched, a teacup dangling from 2 fingers. His face was lined, the mouth drawn down even in rest. The eyes, though still, were searching. It hit me all at once, how little I had looked at myself in the last year. Not glanced, not passed by a mirror, but really looked. The man in the glass wasn't the one I remembered. He was older, yes, but also quieter, smaller, not physically, but in presence. It was as if the edges of him had dulled over time, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Behind me, through the same glass, I could see the shed in the distance, just a shadow between trees. Two reflections in one frame. A man and a shelter. A life and a life in hiding. I stared for a long time, unsure of which I felt closer to. I turned from the window and walked outside. The sun had finally emerged from behind the clouds, casting long bands of light across the porch. I stepped down onto the grass and followed the path past the fence, through the trees, and toward the edge of the property where the land dipped into a shallow ravine. I hadn't been down that way since the autumn before last. The trail was overgrown, but I recognized the way my boots remembered the slope, the rocks, the small log that had fallen years ago and never been cleared. At the bottom was the creek, thin and slow this time of year, its surface scattered with leaves and bits of broken branches. I sat on an old stump and watched the water drift past. I remembered bringing Thomas here when he was little. He would collect smooth stones and try to skip them, laughing each time one made it more than 2 hops. I remembered showing him how to find minnows in the shallows, how to cup his hands gently and wait for the water to still before dipping them under. I remembered the first time he stopped coming with me, how I told myself he was just getting older. But deep down, I had known something else had started to grow between us. A distance that had no name then, only the soft sting of absence. I picked up a stick and traced lines in the dirt. There was no one to see them, and no need to keep them. They disappeared with the next breeze. That felt right. When I made my way back to the house, the sun had shifted lower, painting the yard in amber and gold. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black, and sat on the porch, resting the mug on the rail beside me. I could hear faint movement in the shed, her footsteps, the creak of the cot, maybe the baby stirring. I didn't move. I let the sounds wash over me. Just before sunset, Thomas's car appeared at the end of the drive. It was sudden. No call, no warning. Just the hum of the engine rolling over gravel, the flash of his headlights catching the edge of the trees as he turned in. I stood slowly, heart tightening in my chest. He parked near the house and stepped out with his phone in one hand, car keys in the other. His face was set, serious, like a man arriving on business. He saw me on the porch and gave a curt nod. I returned it, but said nothing. He walked up the steps, stopping 2 feet away. I could see the hesitation in his shoulders, the stiffness in his jaw. His eyes flicked past me toward the shed. He didn't ask, not directly, but he didn't need to. The silence between us held too much history for small talk. I watched his reflection in the window behind me, his posture, his expression. I saw both of us, father and son, caught between what had been and what was now. A line had been drawn, not in anger, but in difference, and neither of us had stepped over it. He told me something about his work, about a new project, about a meeting that had gone well. I listened. I nodded at the right parts, but I could feel the strain in his words, the way he circled around something unspoken. Finally, he asked if I was okay. I said yes. He didn't believe me, but he didn't press. We stood there, the porch boards creaking beneath us, the air cooling by the second. When he turned to leave, he paused. He looked toward the shed, then at me, and for the first time in years, he looked at me not as a man growing old, not as an obligation, not as a problem to be managed, but as someone he didn't understand. That moment passed quickly. He nodded again, tighter this time, and left. I stood at the window after he drove away. I watched my reflection fade as the light drained from the sky. The man in the glass blurred, and then there was only the dark and the distant flicker of the lantern inside the shed. I pressed my palm to the window, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone in the house. I just felt quiet and seen. The next morning broke without ceremony. There were no birdsong flurries, no golden light streaking through the curtains, just a soft, milky grayness that seemed to hover everywhere, as if the house had drawn the clouds down over itself like a blanket. I sat in the kitchen with my hands wrapped around a warm mug and listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional crackle of the old ceiling light. The clock above the sink ticked with its familiar uneven rhythm. But something else filled the room, a kind of waiting, a tension beneath the calm, like the air before a storm, but not the kind that rattles the windows, the kind that changes something permanent. I had barely touched my breakfast. A piece of toast, buttered and cold, sat untouched on the plate. My appetite had been slipping for a while now, but it had nothing to do with food. It was the weight of time, the slow erosion of urgency. Some days I felt more like a caretaker of objects than a participant in anything. The broom still leaned against the pantry door from yesterday. The kettle still bore the faint ring from last week's tea. Everything was still. Too still. Then the phone rang. It was the old landline mounted on the wall by the back door, the one that hadn't rung in months. I stared at it as if it were something foreign, as if it didn't belong here anymore. Its shrillness tore through the quiet like a blade. I stood slowly and picked up the receiver, pressing it to my ear with a kind of resignation, already bracing myself for the voice on the other end. It was Thomas. His tone was brisk, practical, but I knew it well enough to hear the strain beneath the surface. He said there had been a decision. About the property. About the long-term care discussions we had never truly finished. He spoke like a man announcing a meeting outcome. Clinical, detached, already rehearsed. I could tell he had convinced himself this was necessary. A transition. A safer arrangement. I didn't interrupt him. When he finished, there was silence. I didn't offer a response. I simply placed the receiver back into its cradle and stood there with my hand resting on it for a moment longer than needed. The quiet in the kitchen no longer felt like comfort. It felt like the tail end of something irreversible. I walked out to the shed. The grass was damp from an overnight drizzle. The sky had begun to brighten slightly, but the clouds still hung low and stubborn. As I approached, I saw the door ajar and heard the faintest sound of humming. She sat near the cot, brushing the baby's hair back gently, singing something under her breath that I couldn't place. It wasn't a lullaby. It was older, maybe something she had been sung once herself, back before all of this. She looked up when I entered. I didn't speak. I placed a folded slip of paper on the edge of the shelf beside the notebook. A bank form, a signature line, a quiet contract of decision. I had gone into town 2 days earlier without telling her. I had signed over the deed. The land, the house, the structure around us. It was no longer in my name. Not entirely. I had redrawn the lines, quietly, legally, irrevocably. She looked at the paper, but said nothing. I stepped back outside and stood on the porch for a long while. The wind moved gently through the trees. A loose shutter tapped against the siding like a heartbeat. I could feel the pressure in my chest rising, not from anger or fear, but from the weight of knowing I had done something that could not be undone. Not for revenge, not out of pity, but because something deep in me had shifted. A silence had cracked, and in the crack, a decision had grown. Later that afternoon, I heard Thomas's car again. This time, I didn't go outside. I watched from the hallway window as he stepped out, papers in his hand. his face drawn and focused. He walked to the porch, knocked once, then opened the door and let himself in. I stood in the kitchen as he entered, his eyes scanning the space like he was taking inventory. He asked if I had received the letter from the elder care office. I nodded. He began explaining timelines, facilities, potential financial options. I said nothing. I waited until he paused and then walked to the drawer by the sink and handed him the same paper I had left in the shed. He read it, his brow tightening, his mouth slowly parting. His hands trembled slightly, just enough for me to notice. He looked at me then, not with rage, not with understanding, just confusion. That soft, unraveling confusion that overtakes a person when they realize the story they've been telling themselves is no longer true. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He folded the paper once, carefully, and placed it on the table. Then he turned and walked out the front door. I watched his car disappear down the road, the tires splashing slightly in the gravel puddles. I stood there long after the dust had settled. That evening, I walked through the house, slowly. I touched the backs of chairs, the door frames, the edge of Margaret's sewing desk. I ran my fingers along the faded wallpaper, the corners of picture frames, the smoothed surfaces of knobs worn down from years of turning. It wasn't grief I felt. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, something heavier. The silence hadn't left. It had simply changed shape. I returned to the shed once more, this time with the small oil lamp from my bedroom. The girl stood when I arrived. She met my eyes for the first time in days, and for a moment we said everything without speaking. I handed her the lamp. She took it. We stood in that space for a long time, two people on either side of something that had once been distance and was now a kind of trust. The night came slowly. The wind pressed softly against the shed, and I sat by the kitchen window, staring out into the dark where I knew the lamp still glowed. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the house was shrinking around me. I didn't feel like I had failed. The silence, the one that had ruled my days for so long, had finally fallen. Not with noise, but with choice. I woke before the sun again. The air inside the house was still, heavier than usual, as if it had soaked up the weight of the last few weeks and settled into the floorboards. I didn't light the lamp. I didn't boil the kettle. I just sat in the dark for a long time, feeling the wood beneath me, the cool breath of early morning slipping through the cracks around the windows, the slow pulsing of my own heartbeat in the quiet. The walls didn't speak. The old refrigerator didn't hum. Even the wind outside held back, like everything in the world was waiting. I had known for days that this morning would come. There are moments in life that move like a current beneath still water. You don't see the pull until you've already begun drifting. By the time I recognized where I was being taken, I had already let go of the shore. That's how reckoning works, I think. It doesn't crash through your door. It waits until you open it yourself. I stood slowly, the joints in my knees protesting, and dressed with the same quiet care I used when Margaret was still sleeping. My hands moved out of habit, shirt, belt, jacket. I stepped outside into the gray morning and felt the moisture in the air gather on my skin. The world was wrapped in fog. The shed was barely visible, a faint outline at the edge of the property, like a memory just out of reach. I didn't go to the shed. Not yet. Instead, I walked the perimeter of the yard, past the trees we planted the year Thomas was born, past the rusted swing set we never took down, past the row of faded markers in the soil where Margaret had once grown wildflowers with names I could never pronounce. I touched the wooden fence, ran my hand along the peeling paint, and paused where one of the boards had split from rot. Time had made its home in everything. When I finally turned toward the shed, the sun had begun to rise, just barely, casting a thin gold line across the treetops. I could see the girl moving inside. She was feeding the baby, her back turned to the door, rocking gently in the chair I had pulled from the attic. The light from her lantern still glowed faintly through the window. I didn't disturb her. I walked back to the porch and sat with my hands folded, waiting. I heard the car before I saw it. Thomas never sped when he visited. He came up the road like someone arriving to collect something they'd already claimed. But today, he parked differently, angled slightly, tires half on the grass. He stepped out in a jacket I had never seen before, with a folder tucked under one arm, and that expression he wore when he was trying not to show he was angry. He didn't look at the house. He looked straight toward the shed. He didn't ask if I was well. He didn't comment on the weather. He walked up the steps and handed me the folder. Inside were printed pages, financial statements, housing options, a notarized copy of the conservatorship petition. He had filed it the day after our last conversation. I read slowly. I already knew what was there. He said I wasn't safe, that my decisions weren't rational, that I had made choices that endangered my future and compromised the family's assets. He used words like decline, vulnerability, intervention. I didn't answer him. I closed the folder and placed it on the table beside me. He stood in front of me for a long time. I could feel the weight of everything he didn't say pressing down between us. I remembered when he was small, how he used to lean into my side during thunderstorms, how his fingers clung to the seams of my shirt. I remembered the day he moved out, how he avoided hugging me, as if his new independence might dissolve if he touched the past too long. I remembered how far apart we had drifted, not from malice, but from erosion. Now he stood before me as a man, and I saw no boy in him. Only calculation, only disappointment. He turned toward the shed. That's when I stood. I told him the deed had already been signed, that the land and the house and everything on it had been reassigned, that what he was trying to protect was no longer his to inherit, that the silence he had mistaken for surrender had simply been waiting for its shape. He didn't speak. I told him I had seen him from the window 2 nights ago, laughing on his phone, driving away without once looking back. I told him the man who leaves without questions has no right to return with claims. Still, he didn't speak, so I handed him a second envelope. It held the legal notice of transfer, the bank statements, the final revision of my will. I had given what remained of my name to someone who didn't ask for it, but earned it in a way he had forgotten how. He opened the envelope with hands that trembled. I sat back down. He read each page slowly. His face didn't change at first, but as the weight of it settled, I saw the crack form, not on the surface, deeper. The collapse wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It was internal, like a man realizing he'd been walking in the wrong direction for too long. He asked why. I said nothing, because silence was the only language he had ever taught me to use with him, and now it was the only one I had left to give back. He stood there, the folder in one hand, the envelope in the other, and the world behind him fading into the mist. Then he left. He didn't slam the door of his car. He didn't peel down the road. He just drove away, and with each foot of gravel behind him, I felt something loosen in my chest. Later that evening, the girl knocked on the door of the house. She held the baby in one arm, and in the other, the notebook. She didn't step inside. She didn't speak. She just handed me the pages she had added. There were no signatures, no declarations, just stories, quiet ones, about fear, about hunger, about a bench in a bus station, about a man who had offered her a sandwich and then followed her 2 cities too far, about a child who had never known a crib, only motion. I accepted the pages, closed the notebook, and nodded. She returned to the shed. That night, the house made no sound, no creaks, no sighs, no ticking clock. It didn't need to, because silence, when it finally falls, is not absence. It's the sound of things settling into place.